going to be talking this afternoon about abuse, and I'm going to be presenting a presentation that I do called Abuse Stops Here. Let me tell you just briefly about myself. I am a licensed counselor in private practice. Probably partly because of that career, I'm often brought into situations where I'm called upon to deal with very sensitive issues within communities, within families, and within congregations. And I'm a church-attending believer, and so I often find myself in a church context or a community of faith context dealing with abuse situations because, unfortunately, they happen in those contexts, as we know, and they happen in families, and they happen in places we would never suspect them of happening. And so I'm often called upon to advocate for victims, and because I've often played that role, I've decided to do some public education so that I can help people come alongside me in advocating for victims and also helping perpetrators, helping congregations and families and communities know how to spot a perpetrator, how to help a victim, and how to handle these very delicate situations. So I want to start with just some basic relationship facts, how relationships work. And I'm going to kind of start with the family, and then I'm going to branch out into the family of God or the community of faith. And so let me start with the family and talk about how relationships work within the family. As I've experienced life and as I've studied the scriptures and come to an understanding of how relationships work, what I've realized is that we need God to really love one another. So we all have kind of this bucket in which we have a certain amount of natural affection. You know, we like our friends, we fall in love and get married, we love our children, but we will always come to a point in our relationships where that love is tested, and where we need an inflow of divine love to empower us to walk beyond that point and continue in that relationship and continue loving that person. Have you found that to be true, that sometimes you just need God to help you love people, right? And so that's, really foundational to good psychology, is the connection with a divine source so that we can continue to love one another. But another thing that I've noticed is there's not only a power source in God, but God has given us a structure to love, a certain way that we love. If we don't have that structure in our lives, it's kind of like going down to the river with a basket to get water. What's going to happen? The water's going to flow through the basket. You're not going to have the water. The water was there, but you had the wrong vessel. So what we need, in addition to the inflow of divine power to love people, is we need a certain structure or a form to our relationships. And that's where I believe the writings of inspiration are coming from when we see moral codes and moral laws and moral boundaries. We see, for instance, that sexuality is designed by God to be within very, very specific constraints. Heterosexual marriage is where we experience sexuality. And what I've noticed as a human being and as a student of psychology and of scripture is when we get outside of those boundaries, we encounter disaster. Can any of you affirm that in your experience or in your observation? I certainly can on many levels. And so God gives us a very specific form to our relationships. And I want to look at how that looks in what I call the life timeline, the relationship timeline, or the relationship cycle. And what I'm talking about when I say the relationship cycle or the life cycle is the relationships that we experience as our lives unfold from infancy to adulthood and into old age. And here's the nutshell that I want to give you up front, and then I'm going to be emphasizing this throughout this portion of my presentation. And that is that God has created human life such that every stage of our relational journey prepares us for the next stage. Every relationship we have gives us tools and abilities and literally structures the brain so that we can then have the basic necessities to function in the next stage. So beginning with infancy, our relationship with our mother equips us to then relate to our father, and then the father relationship, the parental relationship, equips us to relate to our siblings, and then the sibling relationship equips us to relate to the first chosen relationship, which is friendship, And then friendship equips us ultimately to choose a life partner, get married, and the cycle continues throughout life. Do you see what I'm saying? So I want to look at this life cycle step by step and give you some of the facts involved. Of course, the first relationship we all enjoy is our relationship with what? With mommy. I mean, that's the first substantial connection we as human beings have. And according to God's design, the relationship with a mother is a very, very intimate one and very, very special one. And as I've studied neuroscience, I've recognized that the child's brain is literally formatted through the relationship with the mother, first and foremost, and then continuing through life. And so there's this profound formatting that goes on, such that if there isn't enough formatting, that individual will have struggles in life, sociologic struggles, educational struggles. There are literally deficiencies in brain formation that occur purely as a result of lack of touch stimulation in infancy. And of course, the touch stimulation, for the most part, comes from who? From mom. I mean, why did God make babies so cute and so squishy and so adorable and squeezably soft? Because he wanted them to be picked up and connected via the skin. Why did God create this method of feeding babies that involves skin-to-skin contact, i.e. breastfeeding? Because he wanted that connection between the infant and the mother through the skin. What the child gets from that connection is a sense of identity and a sense of significance, because that's their most highly developed sense. They really can't see well, they can't smell well, they don't always smell very good, they can't taste anything. You've seen what babies eat, you just go yuck, and that's because they can't really taste anything. It's mostly about texture. So their most highly developed sense is the skin, and that is the avenue through which God designed they should receive the very first message, you are loved. And that when that child does not get that message, you are loved, it starts developing this infant form of depression. I mean, this is like scientifically documented. It's called marasmus, where the child will literally become depressed and fail to thrive. There have been stories of orphanages where babies were dying in droves and they didn't have an infection and they didn't have malnutrition. They didn't have any reason except those babies were not being what? They were not being touched. They were not being held. And so that skin-to-skin contact is very, very essential to the formation of that child's brain and that child's ability to then relate to other people down the line throughout life. There are so many ways in which this happens, and I'm going to be going into that in a little more detail in a few moments here. But who comes next in the life journey? Typically, the father is not as connected to the infant. I mean, I've observed in men a fear of holding babies a lot of times because they are afraid they're going to drop them or break them or something, you know. And so men are often not as involved with that child in the first stages of infancy, but once the child starts developing a personality and being a little more of a toddler, then dad gets more involved. And usually it's about 3 years old that the father starts having a really profound impact on that child's life. Now, it's very interesting because the father will stretch the child and the mother will nurture the child. So the mother will sort of conform herself to the child. Oh, did you get a boo-boo? And dad will say instead, oh, you got a cut on your knee, let's go fishing. So he'll stretch the child, he'll talk in adult language to the boy or girl, and that child will then acquire new words, whereas the mother will keep conforming to the child, typically. And so father and mother play very, very important and somewhat differentiated roles in the raising of that child. Men are more influential in play and in skill building of a certain sort, and mothers are more nurturing with their children. You know, God does all kinds of things in even the body of a woman and even in the body of a man. There are certain hormones that increase in the male body when the wife is pregnant. And the triggering for those hormones comes through undetectable smells called pheromones that the woman is now exuding now that she's pregnant. He picks up on those scents. He's not even fully conscious of them, but they're increasing his levels of certain hormones. One of them is called the monogamy hormone because it sort of opposes the effect of testosterone and makes that man less likely to wander. So God does everything he can within even the brain and even neuroscience to keep men faithful to their wives. A lot of times when we veer from God's plan, we're not only sort of warring against his moral code in the scriptures, but we're warring against nature itself, you see. So the life journey continues, and then after mom and after dad, we have what? Typically, we have siblings, right? Brothers and sisters that we have to come to love. And this is the first horizontal relationship. So we're going to develop a whole new set of skills in that relationship. And that's going to equip us for the next type of relationship that comes along. And that, of course, is friendships. And friendships, again, are the first chosen relationship that God brings to us in the life journey. And so we need to have those skills that we learned with our siblings of negotiation and of conflict resolution and of sharing, because if we don't have those skills developed when we meet friends, we're going to be at odds with our friends a lot of the time. So we learn those things with brothers and sisters, move on to friendship, and then of course that moves us into the place where we can eventually choose a life partner. And think about it, with a life partnership and marriage, isn't it mostly friendship most of the time? I mean, of course, there's this romantic component and there's sex and things that you don't have in a friendship, but isn't it for the most part? Like, nobody has sex all day, not even young people. And so it's for the most part just a very, very close, committed friendship. And of course, you've learned that skill in the previous stage. So can you see how God kind of orchestrates life so that we keep learning and learning and learning about love throughout life? And the crowning act of our relational timeline is, guess what? Being a grandparent. And the cool thing about being part of a community of faith is that when you get old, you can become a parent to not just a biological family, but you can become a parent to a congregation. I often feel like a big mother sow, and all my little piglets, they're always coming over for food, and they're just always coming for something, because I'm a mother in Israel, and I love to nurture young people. I've learned how to mother through raising my own children, and I will be a mother until I die, and I don't have to graduate from that or age out of it. Isn't that a blessing? We can keep learning using those skills throughout life. So tragically, sometimes the home, I don't know if I have a pointer on here, do I? No. Sometimes the home sweet home, that is designed by God to be a place of protection, a soft place to fall, a place where we can be shielded from the dangers of this crazy world that we live in. Sometimes the home itself becomes a battleground through abuse. And then sadly, the church, which can be is like the family of God, or the synagogue, which is like the family of God, the community of faith, can also become a battleground where we experience abuse. It's almost like an autoimmune disease. Abuse is like an autoimmune disease, in that the very system put in place by a loving God to protect us actually becomes something from which we need protection. And social services steps in, and all kinds of disastrous things happen because that system that God put in place actually attacked instead of protecting. And so that can be a very tragic scenario, and it's much more harmful than that same abuse that occurs outside of that system. When we take the literature that shows the long-term effects of, for instance, sexual abuse that happens randomly outside of the family, as severe and terrible as that is, it's never as bad as incestuous sexual abuse perpetrated by a father or an uncle, someone within the system. It's always worse when it's within the system. And I don't know of any literature to this effect, but I believe that when abuse is perpetrated within the family of God, that is also doubly harmful. And I can tell you why. Because people come to expect godly behavior from their godly leaders. And they, to some degree, look to that leader to get an idea of what God himself is like. And then when they get the opposite, their relationship with God is brought into question. And we see this again and again in victim advocacy, as those people's relationship with God comes to pieces as a result of perpetration within the community of faith. So let's look at some of the types of abuse. It can be a very varied thing, and I'm doing a very broad stroke approach here. Most of my experience is with sexual abuse, and most of my experience is with sexual abuse within a church context. But let me give you the broad picture here first and foremost. One type of abuse is simply neglect, not giving those that are dependent upon you what they need to thrive. That's neglect. Physical abuse is well known and well understood. Verbal abuse and emotional abuse are often very much tied together. Verbalizing is the medium through which we typically inflict emotional abuse, or withdrawing from verbalizing, not speaking to someone. This is often not considered abuse, or it's not recognized because it's not as quantifiable. You don't have bruises on the body like you do with physical abuse, but it is very, very damaging and can be very devastating to a child. In fact, many of the clients that I have in counseling suffered from very subtle, often, forms of emotional abuse that have left them scarred, and they struggle to overcome those scars. Of course, there's sexual abuse. There can be such a thing as economic abuse, where an individual who is dependent is not provided for, and then religious abuse, which is what I'm talking about when I talk about abuse perpetrated within the family of God or the family of faith. But what we often find, too, is that happens in a context where we see things like legalism or separatism or various unhealthy forms of spirituality, where unnecessary burdens are put on people and standards are unnecessarily harsh, or people are told not to stay in contact with their families. Their influences are cut off by the religion that they're involved in, which really there's a line over which they walk, and they become a cult more than a religion. So we need to watch for those things because they can happen in any congregation. Now I want to talk for a moment about bonding and abuse, and going again back to the family. The best prevention for abuse within the family is secure bonds. There is an inverse relationship, for instance, with the father's involvement with that child. I've heard that there's research, I haven't been able to find it, but I've heard that there's research, and I believe this to be true in principle, so I don't feel bad sharing it with you, that shows that if the more a father changes a child's diaper, the less likely he is to abuse that child. So there's an inverse relationship between those two things. Isn't that interesting? So you need to all go and, change your grandchildren or your children's diapers. I'm sure you don't have little ones at home anymore, but you need to change as many diapers as you can, because that signals a secure bond. The more you minister to that child's needs, the more involved you are in their care as a parent, the less likely you are to then abuse that child. So when we see secure bonds, I have a friend who was, exercised a little bit of poor judgment. She had a very steep driveway, and she got in a wagon one day with one of her kids and said, let's go down the driveway. They ended up crashing into the trees, and one of the children got injured. She took them into the hospital, and to her bewilderment, found herself accused of abusing the child. They didn't believe her story. They were like, yeah, is that really how the child got hurt? And then the individuals at the hospital noticed the child putting her head on the mother's lap, or some kind of gesture of bonding, and they knew that it wasn't abuse at that point. So that's what we look for, is that secure bond. The Cinderella effect, I don't mean this to disparage step parents, but the Cinderella effect is something that can be problematic when a parent is not a biological parent to a child, when that parent comes along later in that child's life. The Cinderella effect is, of course, talking about step parents. Because of the lack of that history, that bonding history, that individual is more likely to see that child as, for instance, a sex object. It's very difficult to see a baby that you nurtured from diapers as a sex object. It's a little less difficult when you see that child at 15 years old and you don't have a history with the child. So we call this Cinderella effect, and it's very tragic. And I don't mean that to disparage step-parents, because they can be very, very helpful in that child's life and can really be very saving in their influence. But then we have this reality. All of the literature says, pretty much points to the reality that the child is best off with a biological mother and a biological father. The children that are raised in a home with a bio father and bio mother are better off than any other configuration. I'm not saying that to say if you were raised by a step parent or if you had a single mom that you're a hopeless case, because God can work with our brokenness. But I do want to say we need to leave the ideal where it belongs. I would say even children raised in a same-sex parented home that were loving parents and very good caregivers are better off than a child raised in an abusive home. But I still want that ideal in place of a father and a mother because that child needs both of those influences. You see where I'm coming from here. So we want to be honest about the Cinderella effect. That absence of a bond increases the tendency toward or the danger of abuse. And again, as I mentioned before, domestic abuse and incest are more damaging than the equivalent that occurs outside of the home, like an autoimmune disease. There are some changes that occur in the brain, and I want to talk just a little bit about bonding and brain development here. In trust bonding, the emotional circuits in the brain calm in the presence of another person. Babies have one of two states, calm and connected, or anxious and disconnected. That's how dependent they are on that relationship. And so that baby will be calm as long as it feels connected to its caregiver. That mutual calming indicates a solid bond. So in abuse, that part of the brain becomes aroused and defensive. We call it the limbic system, or the emotional brain. It's sort of in the center of the brain, and it's comprised of all these different components. That part of your brain actually exists when you're born. The cerebral cortex, which is the part surrounding it, is really very, very minimal when we're born, and it's over the first 3 years of life that the cerebral cortex develops. So we're born with that emotional brain, and that's the part of us that gets formatted. So the quality of our bond with our parents is what really programs the emotional part of our brain. And this is what we find is that people that had, inconsistent or chaotic or even abusive parenting have limbic brain arousal problems where they're constantly in a state of anxiety. It's kind of like survival mode where they're always looking for the next threat. And so God wanted this to be different. He wanted that emotional brain to be calm in the presence of a caregiver. And unfortunately, that's not always what we get. And we end up with what we call reactive attachment disorder, or RAD. How many of you have heard of reactive attachment disorder? It's being talked about a lot in children. What we find is that those children who've been raised in chaotic environments or abusive environments lose the ability to bond well, and particularly the ability to trust. So their trust mechanism is either overactive or underactive. They have a tendency to either trust too easily or not trust at all. So it's like something within them is broken, something that God designed should have been built when they were very young. And what will happen is, with that limbic arousal state, they will believe things that a child would believe. If the thinking part of your brain didn't exist, you would believe all kinds of things that your emotions told you to believe. So let me give you an example. I was walking down the road the other day. A person was walking down the sidewalk coming from the opposite direction. And as she passed me, she started to scream, expletives and all kinds of attacking kind of things. I'd never seen this person before. It was a very strange experience. Because I'm an adult and also because I'm a therapist, I knew that that person was mentally ill. But if I'd been 5 years old, I wouldn't have known that. My cerebral cortex wouldn't be working. I wouldn't be able to form my belief about that experience effectively. And so I would believe things like, there's something wrong with me, I did something wrong, or that person's going to kill me, or I'm never going to be able to get away from them, or something else irrational. This is what happens to children raised in an abusive environment. It's always my fault, I can't trust anyone, I'm stupid, that's why they argue, and so on and so forth. So I want to talk a bit now about church abuse that occurs in the community of faith. And I'm going to get to how to heal from the abuse a little bit later down the road, but I want to talk first about prevention of abuse in a religious context, and then, of course, what to do and how to help those victims and the perpetrators. So let's get into this. we often use the analogy of wolves in sheep's clothing. Wolves in sheep's clothing, to refer to individuals who use a pretension of religion to garb themselves and make themselves less threatening to potential victims. It is a known fact that perpetrators will come to congregations because believers tend to be very trusting, and we tend to want to include more people. We're always inviting people and opening our doors to the community and so forth. And so we're inclined to really trust people, and perpetrators know this, so they will often target churches, synagogues, and other communities of faith. There are 6 basic stages of grooming. First of all, targeting the victim, choosing someone. And perpetrators have good discernment of this. They know who the weak ones are. Then gaining the victim's trust, of course, gradually cultivating a relationship. One of the things you'd be amazed at is how long some perpetrators will take to cultivate that relationship. They will often fill a need in that individual's life so that that individual doesn't have an intact family, or doesn't have lunch money, or doesn't have any way to get to their, Boy Scout meetings or whatever. They'll often fill a need in that individual's life. Then they will begin to isolate the victim, saying things like, look, don't tell anyone else what's going on here. This is a secret between you and me. Then they will start to sexualize the relationship, and of course I'm referring to sexual abuse here. And then after sexualizing the relationship, perpetrating abuse on that child, they will work very hard to maintain control of that child so the child does not tell anyone else, and so the matter never becomes known. Yeshua said, if anyone shall offend one of these little ones who believe in me, it would be better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck and that he were drowned in the depths of the sea. This is a very severe statement by Yeshua. He is basically saying that a perpetrator of abuse on a child, a little one, is so wrong that that individual deserves the most horrific form of capital punishment. So let's explore what he meant by little ones. I think he was primarily referring to new believers, people that are young in their spiritual experience, but it actually applies very broadly to anyone who is weaker or smaller in any way. The word is literally mikros. So often people with a history of abuse that are very vulnerable, people that have a lack of support, people who have low self-worth, home life troubles, unsatisfied longings for love, or an unhealthy fear or deference for authority. We want to be respectful of authority, but we don't want to put them in place of God, So that individual will often look for that type of individual, and when Yeshua said that this individual deserved capital punishment, he was saying that the individual that they're perpetrating on is someone very, very vulnerable, very extremely vulnerable. 54% of sexual assaults are never reported to the police. Think about why for a moment. I encounter this all the time when I work with victims. Typically, that individual is abused by a man in authority. Okay, so I'm going to say a man in a suit, right? And then what we typically do is we take them and put them in front of a whole tribunal of men in suits and tell them to tell their story. And that individual has no guarantee that those men in suits will believe their story. So we're really re-traumatizing them when we do that, especially when they aren't believed. This is why they don't report. 54% of sexual assaults are never reported to the police. I'll share my own story with you maybe toward the end. 97% of rapists never spend a day in jail. Let me share some more facts with you. 1 in 6 women are victims of attempted or completed rape. 9 out of 10 victims of rape are female. 1 in 33 men are victims of attempted or completed rape. The highest risk years are 12 to 24. More than 50% of sexual assault victims are under 12. 44% are under 18. Every 2 minutes, someone in the U.S. is sexually assaulted, and the stats go on and on and on. I call this the silence of the lambs. Most of these cases are never made known, and that's why you're here, to learn how to handle them and bring them into the light of day so some positive good can come to that victim. You know, it's very interesting, the word sociopath, the core word there is socio, right? And that's the core word from which we get social. So often a sociopath will have a very social nature and often be socially gifted. This is why it's so difficult to deal with situations like, or to detect these kinds of problems, because that individual is often very charismatic, very lovable, and people can't conceive of him doing such a thing. We hear this all the time. So let me talk to you a little bit about perpetrator bias. Perpetrator bias is a reality I struggle with constantly in these cases. The social system of which we are a part, whether it be a faith community or a local community or a family, often has more invested in that perpetrator than in the victim. In other words, the perpetrator is more important to that system, and in fact, sometimes indispensable to that system than the victim. In fact, often the victim is very dispensable, or a newcomer to the system, or someone very weak in that social milieu. So what we find is the perpetrators will capitalize on that fact, and this is why we are so afraid of cults. Because in a cult, one personality gets pretty much total control of a group of people, and then once that individual has control, he's completely indispensable to that group, because without the cult leader, you don't have a group. And so those individuals will render an obedience to that individual that is completely out of sync with anything that's practical and realistic and reasonable. So what we find is that there is a natural bias toward the perpetrator. We are more inclined to believe the perpetrator. But think for a moment about who is likely to be telling the truth. Now, I'm going to come back to that point, but I first want to say there is such a thing as a false accusation. These things occur. I don't believe every single accusation that comes to me. Are you with me so far? Okay, so there's such a thing as a false accusation. But these tend to be few and far between. There is usually some kind of historic vendetta between the alleged victim and the alleged perpetrator, or there's some kind of mental illness where that individual would rather have negative attention than no attention at all, or there's just something off about that victim. And so there are false accusations, but they are, in my experience, few and far between. Typically, the victim is telling the truth. Now, because the victim is often telling the truth doesn't mean that they're always telling the truth, so we need to corroborate with evidence. But at the same time, the inclination is for the victim to be telling the truth, the perpetrator to be lying, and yet our bias is toward the perpetrator. We need to correct for that and believe victims unless we have a reason not to. And then, of course, try to corroborate with evidence. I like to point out that there is a spectrum of abuse. On the one hand, we have forcible rape. We would never accuse a victim of forcible rape of any kind of accountability or responsibility in that scenario. But not every situation is that clean cut. So we have this spectrum, and on the other end of the spectrum is consensual sex with a subordinate. So let's put it in a community of faith context. The spiritual leader in that community begins to solicit sexual favors from the congregants, and he finds some congregants that are willing to consensually give those sexual favors. Happens all the time. Is it true that because of the consent, it was not abuse? I would argue no, that it's still abuse because there's a huge power differential. Remember Yeshua's statement about little ones and exploiting the vulnerable. So because of that power differential, you really do have abuse of various kinds and to various degrees. Definitely abuse of the spiritual office that individual held and the privileges that come with that office, but even abuse of the individual. And so I feel it very, very important to point that out, because often we have situations like this and people will say, oh, well, she didn't fight. scratch his eyeballs out, well, then it wasn't abuse, it wasn't rape. Dealt with the situation not too long ago where there was a very well-respected leader in the spiritual community that I'm part of, and he was traveling internationally, and he abused a young girl. He didn't force her, but he entrapped her in his hotel room. He was the big, heavyweight spiritual guide. She was a brand new convert, and she was afraid not to cooperate with him because he could punish her socially. This is her newfound community of faith. She could be ostracized. She didn't know he was much bigger than she was. She didn't know that he wouldn't attack her physically. They were trapped in a hotel room. He said he was going to give her a counseling session, close the door, and it didn't turn into a counseling session at all. She didn't fight back. This is very, very common. You see, women who fight back often get injured. They get injured more often when they fight back than when they don't. So if they don't fight back, they get raped. If they do fight back, they're more likely to get injured. They don't always. But they know that intuitively, and so some of them just consent. But that doesn't mean that they weren't raped. And in this individual's case, she was raped. It was rape. He used his power advantage. He used every means. He manipulated. He connived. He got her in his hotel room, took advantage of her. But what happened was really kind of cool because she had more guts than he thought she did. And she ended up calling him. This was an international situation, so he went back to the States. She was in a foreign country, and she called him and recorded the phone call. And the phone call had evidence of what had happened. And she turned that in to the administrators of the church that she was part of, and the whole thing came out as a result of what she did. This is always the struggle, is that the victims have to give us evidence as much as they can, and at least a written testimony. Anyway, so many people who found out about that situation, when they learned that this girl had not fought back physically, assumed that it was consensual, first of all, but it wasn't. And so it was somewhere in here. And it was amazing to me that they didn't understand Psychology 101. And I'm going to get into that in a moment here. Here are some of the action steps. And I want to talk first about common missteps. So, number one, believing that if a woman doesn't fight, it is an abuse. Not true. Don't believe that. Men are bigger than women. Sometimes they submit to save their lives, they feel in that moment. So failing to recognize Stockholm Syndrome. Does anybody know what Stockholm Syndrome is? Stockholm Syndrome, you've heard of this. It was an event that happened in Sweden. There was a bank robbery, and the bank robbers basically kidnapped the staff of the bank for several days before the police got there and a SWAT team came in and whatever they did to finally break it up. But by that time, the staff of the bank had actually become bonded to the bank robbers, and they were kind of siding with the bank robbers. So now we call that Stockholm Syndrome. Sometimes when you are entrapped in a relationship with a perpetrator, you will start to develop a certain sentimental bond with that perpetrator. And we need to be able to recognize that and give that person time and really work with them to come out of that. Advising a victim to confront the perpetrator. This is akin to, chicken comes with all its feathers plucked out. You say, the fox did that to you? Go back to that fox and tell him that was the wrong thing to do, Telling a victim to confront they took advantage of them to begin with because of the power differential. What makes you think that going back to them for more isn't going to yield the same result? That's crazy. Little common sense is really great in situations like this. And then failing to support the victim in the disclosure process, as I mentioned, putting them in front of a tribunal of people that look remarkably like their perpetrator. Now, working with a perpetrator involves a justice and mercy dance, a dance between justice and mercy. We want to extend grace to the perpetrators because, after all, we're all sinners, right? And so we don't want to just consign those individuals to hell. So let's look at how this all works. The Apostle Paul said that he was referencing an abuse situation or an immorality situation in one of his local congregations, and he said, "Deliver such a one to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, that the spirit may be saved in the day of Yeshua. A little leaven leavens the whole lump, therefore purge out the old leaven." So he was saying, take that individual outside. If they're not repentant, put them outside of the congregation so that God can get to them directly. But ultimately, the purpose for what we sometimes call church discipline. The purpose of it is to bring that person around and bring them back to their senses and, of course, back to God. And then Jude said, on some have compassion, making a distinction, but others save with fear, pulling them out of the fire, hating even the garment defiled by the flesh. So I want to look at some facts about what works with bringing people out of these patterns. And we're going to be hearing more about that in the following presentation. But this is what I learned from one study. When offenders are connected to their communities and when they are allowed to work and are intensively involved with the therapeutic community, recidivism or relapse was significantly reduced. So rather than ostracizing those individuals, we want to bring them into the community and then have careful chaperoning and accountability on that individual. The best estimates suggest that 5 to 14% of known sex offenders will commit a subsequent sex crime within 3 to 6 years. And after 15 years, 3/4 will not have recidivated. So it used to be that it would go around that, once a person does this, they're always going to be that way, and they just need to be basically locked up and kept away from society. But these people can be rehabilitated, and we're going to be learning more about that in a moment. Prison sentences without treatment are non-effective. A combination of treatment and supervision is the most effective, and especially early treatment of youth with sexual behavior problems is significantly effective. So the younger, the better. Here's a very important statement from a minister. He said, reconciliation between the abuser and the victim should not be suggested, encouraged, or recommended without qualified professional intervention and a proof of attitude and behavior change. And I love this because sometimes in our faith communities, we idealize grace and forgiveness so much that we don't balance it with a little practical accountability. So yes, we need to make sure there's a disposition of repentance on the part of the wrongdoer, and then we need to work with that situation very carefully and very sensitively so as not to re-traumatize the victim. The long-term effects on the victim, often people will get involved in self-harm, substance abuse. They will become dissociative. They're there, but they're not there. They will often develop eating disorders, depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder. So I'm going to give you some action steps here. First of all, take charge. If an alleged victim is a child, immediately, no matter who you are, report it to the State Child Protective Services or National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-4-A-CHILD. Everybody has access to that phone number. Anytime you hear of child abuse, report it immediately. If the alleged victim is an adult, secure written or recorded testimony, in most cases eliminating the name. So get in writing what they experienced in their congregation at the hands of the leader, and in most cases eliminate the name. Inform the leader that because of the seriousness of the situation, you must inform church administration. So whoever that individual answers to, you will work with that body or that individual or those individuals. Write to, and this is I'm specifically referring to in the Adventist church context because I'm a Seventh-day Adventist, and we call the presidents of our local groups conference presidents. So write to your this is what I do. I write to my conference president and I copy it to the ministerial secretary and the union president, who are officials that are involved but a little more remotely with the local churches. So they have to answer to one another. I don't just write one person because they may drop the ball, but you get 3 people involved in the loop. You do everything the light of day. It was interesting. I was dealing with a situation very close to where I live, and my lawyer told me I was kind of at wit's end because the powers that were not handling it well. And I told my lawyer, well, I'm just going to go to the people in that congregation, start warning them. And he said, no, if you do that, that can be character defamation. You can get into legal trouble if you do that. But write a letter to the officials, to the powers that be, copy it to other powers, and that is qualified privilege, particularly for a professional, someone who's in a position like I'm in. I have qualified privilege to warn, and even a duty to warn, if harm would come to individuals through this individual. So I did that. And by the grace of God, the individual's still looking for a job, let's put it that way, after being hired twice and then dismissed. So I'm thankful for that. Educate yourself. There's a wonderful website called thehopeofsurvivors.com. There's also one called grace.net that works with, it's called Godly Response to Abuse in a Church Environment, I think it is. Help both the perpetrator and the victim find counseling. Those are some sources. My counseling practice is abidecounseling.com. And pray constantly. There's no exact way of handling these situations. So we need to just pray and ask for wisdom. So here it is boiled down. Record the facts objectively, report the incident to civil and church authorities, and refer the victim and the perpetrator for professional help. And let me also give you, let me just move forward really quick here. I want to touch on some things that will help the victim. First of all, learn to trust God, learn to trust people. Begin with pets if you have to. Children and the elderly are good places to start with relationships. Learn to think well. Deal with the negative information that's literally been programmed into you. Learn how to hold positive information in your mind because it takes longer to get lodged in the long-term memory. Make careful, steady effort to learn how to manage your thought life. Learn self-care. Know that God is just. He will deal with that perpetrator in time. It'll take a while sometimes, but He will deal with that individual in time. Scriptural affirmations can be helpful. We tend to carry on the legacy of abuse. Things were done to us. We tend to do to ourselves sometimes what other people did to us. So if we were neglected, we tend to neglect ourselves. If we were emotionally abused, we tend to beat ourselves up verbally. You know, you're so stupid, you're so ugly, this type of thing. We tend to do that as human beings because that's our normal. And so we have to unlearn some of those bad habits sometimes, especially if we've been through abuse. Treat yourself as Yeshua would have treated you. Healthcare, grooming, hygiene, etc., and counseling helps. I want to talk, I want to just share with you my own story. I was part of a very small but very powerful ministry in New York City that involved a group of people in their 20s, about 25, 30 people, all in their 20s, very young, very inexperienced, and we ran 2 restaurants. The Adventist Church has a lot of health ministry and a lot of vegetarian restaurants. We had 2 restaurants there in New York City, and the leader of that ministry, and this is back in the 80s, and I was just a child, so I had no life experience. And the leader of that restaurant was a very charismatic, basically a cult leader is what he turned into. And he perpetrated on every female in that ministry at one point or another. He assaulted me more than once. He harassed me more than once. Fortunately, I had the presence of mind to push back and not to accept, but I went to the powers that were, the board that was over the ministry, and I was told that I was the one with the problem, basically. So that shut me down. I ended up leaving the ministry, and when all the dust settled after leaving the ministry, I realized that I had been intimidated by the individuals in charge and that I should have been more assertive, and I vowed that I would never let human beings intimidate me from what God wanted me to do ever again. That individual ended up continuing in what he was doing. A victim called me a while ago. She'd been impregnated and aborted 3 times because of him, and he never married her. I mean, horrible things happened because nobody ever checked him. Years afterward, I spoke to an individual who told me that the chairman of the board that wouldn't do anything to this man, that wouldn't hold him accountable, did the same thing. There's your reason why he wouldn't hold him accountable. Same thing going on in his life. These are young, vulnerable people getting exploited by the leaders that they basically put on a pedestal. Well, what finally happened is that man, this is amazing. There was nothing I could do, but I prayed for God's will to be done and for God to deal with the situation. You know, God will bring justice. You know, Martin Luther King Jr. said, the arc of the moral universe is very long, but it bends toward justice, and I have found him to be spot on. It takes a long time for these things, but eventually justice comes, and I'll tell you what happened. The chairman of the board that would not correct the man, I'll call the chairman Tom, and the man was Mac, okay? So Tom had a very young daughter, 21 years old. Mac was now 47. The chairman of the board, who would not protect God's daughters, invited Mac to come visit. And Mac was engaged to his 21-year-old daughter, 26 years older than her, within 2 weeks. He was engaged. They got married. She had 6 children. He was so fanatical that one of the children ended up dying unnecessarily. And that kind of cracked the system a little. The mother, by this time, was the daughter of this man, Tom, was desperate to leave because the man was abusive. But she couldn't leave because he'd always take one of the children. Whenever he left, he'd take a child with him, and she couldn't abandon. So she ended up, one day, for some reason we don't know, he left without any of the children, and she left. She ran, and now they're divorced. This is what this situation came to. Many human beings devastated, bruised, broken, because this man was allowed to carry on, and because people like you and me didn't stand up and say enough is enough. So that's why I'm here today. I want to equip us to be bold in Yeshua and speak up. And even if we do it wrong, do something, and continually pray for light and guidance and wisdom to know how to move forward. And I can say that I am very, very grateful to have the opportunity to work with situations like this, because this is where a big wound of mine is, and it helps to minister out of our wounds, and it makes us more effective. So may God bless you as you apply whatever you can apply from what I've presented today.